Your webinar is now live.
Good afternoon, and on behalf of the Gilbert Lecture Series, welcome to this special event with Bill Bohnett of the Greig class of 1970, chair of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, in conversation with Chris Greig, the Walton Senior Research Scientist in the Andlinger Center. They will be discussing our path to reaching net zero carbon emissions goals. But before the program gets underway, I'd like to just make a couple of quick points. First, we're anticipating 30 to 40 minutes of discussion between our speakers, after which we'll take questions from viewers. If you are tuning into this event live, whatever platform you're on, you can get up your questions by typing in the comments at any time before or during the Q&A. The earlier, the better. Or if you prefer, you may send an email to gilbertlectures@princeton.edu. And thank you in advance for taking the opportunity to pose questions to our special guests. In a moment, I'll turn it over to Chris and Bill to begin their conversation, but first, let me introduce them more fully. Chris Greig is the Theodora D. class of 1978 and William H. Walton III class of 1974, senior research scientist at Princeton's Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment. Dr. Greig earned his PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Queensland before launching a 25-year career in industry as an entrepreneur in process technologies, and later in project management and executive roles in the construction and energy resources sectors, including as CEO of ZeroGen, a large-scale carbon capture and storage project in Queensland. In 2011, he joined the faculty of the University of Queensland, where he led both the university's energy initiative and the Dow Center for Sustainable Engineering Innovation. He also served as chairman of the Energy Policy Institute of Australia. Beginning in 2018, he was Gerhard R. Andlinger, class of 1952, visiting fellow in energy and environment at the Andlinger Center, and joined Princeton as a senior research scientist in August last year. This semester, he's teaching a course on Rapid Switch, the energy transition challenge to a low carbon future. The course springs from the work of the Rapid Switch project, which Greig first conceived and initiated at the University of Queensland and is continuing to play a lead role in now at Princeton. Capitalizing on the Rapid Switch energy transitions framework, Chris co-led the recent Net Zero America report that details 5 potential pathways to US net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Joining Chris in conversation is Bill Bohnett of the Greig class of 1970. Prior to his role as chair of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, Bill served for a decade as a member of the Smithsonian's National Board. Bill is also on the executive committee of the U.S. Council on Competitiveness and is a board member of American Forests, the nation's oldest conservation organization, and Little Sun Incorporated, a solar energy nonprofit working in Africa. Bill also is a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. He has served on the boards of the Synergos Institute, City Harvest, the Island School, and New York Sunworks, and has been a member of the National Council of the Environmental Defense Fund and a visiting fellow of the World Resources Institute. He's a graduate of Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He is a tireless advocate for innovation and sustainability and climate policy action in Washington and internationally. Gentlemen, thank you both. And Chris, I turn it over to you.
And thank you very much, Tom. And I'll just add my welcome to Bill. It's an honor to be speaking with you, Bill. And we're here to talk about tackling this global climate challenge. We're already experiencing dangerous consequences of climate change in the US and around the world. And the imperative to urgently curb emissions has been clear for some time. But transforming the global energy economy is enormously challenging and in different ways in different parts of the world. So despite the imperative, we have yet to start even a stalling of what has been a relentless rise in greenhouse gas emissions that started early last century. But there are signs that things are changing. Since the Paris Agreement, we've seen growing momentum from nations, states, and companies to pledge their commitment to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. And from a local perspective, we appear to be on the cusp of the US reasserting itself as a leader of the charge to tackle climate change. But sustained action is going to require bipartisan support. When I say sustained, I mean sustained over multiple decades. So Bill, how do you think we should be framing the climate energy challenge in order to build this enduring bipartisan political, but also public support for tackling climate change?
Thank you, Chris, and delighted to be here and be a part of the Gilbert Lecture Series. Well, it was a hard-fought political decision that we recently made in the States to rejoin 196 countries as part of the Paris Accords in a global consensus to confront the climate crisis. So now it's not whether, it's how. And as you say, it's an immensely complicated task. We are presently preoccupied with the Biden administration's brand new proposal to take a number of actions, which we frankly have not considered before in the States, to assist the private sector, if you will, and to exemplify our commitment to meet our nationally determined contribution to limiting greenhouse gases. I think it's fair to say the major blocs, the US, China, India, Brazil, Russia, the EU, each have different political dynamics. They're each on different paths. So I think we're all going to be more concerned beginning in November, and it will be higher on everyone's radar, what each country or bloc's actual progress or lack thereof towards their 2030 Paris commitments will be. So one hope that I have is that we will be seeing more metrics, if you will, how far along we are, what progress or lack thereof is in the next 10-year period. Chris, as you know, and experts in the field know, in a supreme irony, the United States, because of fracking, which is an irony to end all ironies, oil and gas production, puts us, displacing our coal plants, it puts us in a relatively decent position to meet our 2030 commitments. By no means a slam dunk, but doable. That said, as you know, that is only a small part of the total picture. It's only a small part of the progress that we need to make by 2050 towards net zero. So I think we can demonstrate our leadership and demonstrate our commitment now that we're back in the Paris Accords in a couple of different ways. And maybe we can turn to those in your next question.
Okay, so in terms of how we might take this on, do you see the US, as a global leader in the policy setting, or more in technology research and innovation, or in being a powerhouse an industrial powerhouse to supply technology to the world?
I would say we have potential in all those areas. One, I think it's fair to say, emerging consensus in the States is that we face a legitimate national security concern over China's domination of the electric vehicle supply chain. China has, for example, over a 70% indirect or direct share of the lithium supply, 61% of cathodes, 83% of anodes, 75% of permanent magnets. and 107 out of 142 battery plants are being built or have been built in China. So we face a significant issue, and part of our imperative in the geopolitical space is that we are comfortable with that we're either comfortable with that kind of China dominance, or that should be a significant driver for this country to do more to return supply chains and domestic manufacturing capacity in electric vehicles. I think that's one area that should be on all our radar screens as we think about the next several years. The United States is an innovation leader. It always has been. It's one of our country's great strengths. We have a absolutely magnificent, that's the only word for it, a national lab structure, which has been a part of the federal government's R&D outreach since World War II. And that federal lab, that national lab structure can and should be an important part of how we all think about our capacity to innovate here. And I certainly see you as far more of an expert than I on the various kinds of innovation that we'll need. But I simply point to the Biden administration's current proposal, and I hope a growing consensus in Washington that R&D robustness has to be a part of how we're going to confront this challenge in its various guises. We're well equipped to do that. We're an innovative country. We have capital markets to support any number of emerging technologies. So I'm optimistic there. And I guess the last would be we can and should think about very specifically our manufacturing capacity in the electric vehicle supply chain. That would include things like domestic rare earth processing. That next to none of that takes place now. That's been ceded to China. I think we might profitably think about how we can regain that. And I think what I would emphasize here, coming from originally a Wall Street background, we have a red hot, a white hot U.S. stock market right now, and it's a market that's very receptive to the kind of innovation and company formation and financing that will enable this transition to renewables, electric vehicles, and the like. We have an enormous capacity. The electric vehicle manufacturers have like Tesla, have zoomed in value. We have startups all over the world that are being well funded. So I think we should all think about, we've got a cooperative market right now. Doesn't necessarily mean it'll last forever, but we have a cooperative market that seems eager to let us fund the innovation that we'll need. And that sounds trite, but I think it's an important reality. And we think about our capacity to innovate, we should think about our capital that's available for innovation right now in a market, frankly, that wants to believe in the future of electric vehicles. So those are a couple of different thoughts.
That's excellent. And it's something, as someone who's not from the US, I find striking, is the power of the capital markets to get behind innovation in this country. And it really is a remarkable power. So we've been focusing on what we might do to reduce and motivate efforts to reduce United States emissions. So whether it be, expanding our capacity to produce the equipment such as electric vehicles and solar cells and the like. But one of the arguments that is often raised is we're just one player, and you mentioned the sort of powerhouses of the emissions world earlier in the discussion. And US energy and industrial emissions are probably around 15% of global emissions. And as you point out, with fracking, have been declining. Meanwhile, China's emissions are nearly double US emissions and growing. Emissions in India, Southeast Asia and Africa are also growing rapidly, albeit off a lower base. And there's a fundamental difference between the US and these fast-growing developing nations. The fossil fuel burning plants and assets that they have are quite young. For example, in the US, your average coal-fired power plant is probably 45 years old and mostly ready for retirement. And as you point out, we've seen quite a transition to natural gas assets already. But coal generation assets in developing Asia average less than 15 years, and they may well run for another 30 years. So if our imperative is to reduce emissions globally to sort of roughly net zero by mid-century, this sort of existing young fleet of coal plants in Asia is quite a challenge. And in many cases, they're still adding new coal and gas generation capacity. So what's the answer here for the young coal emissions intensive assets in Asia, and what does it mean for the US?
You know, you got me thinking about this, and then I had, fortunately, a little time, probably not enough, but I'd start by saying we really need, I think, in this country to understand at a much deeper level the truly global nature of this. We've had to come through a politically very divisive period. Each coal plant being built makes the solution to this problem that much harder. And I understand how commonplace that sentiment is, but it's not, I don't think, well understood or well integrated into our thinking. So if you understand that, and you understand, you know, a magnificent communicator, frankly, like Bill Gates, who talks about his principal climate fact is we are currently releasing 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases into the environment each year. So I'd start by saying we need a 5-alarm crisis kind of communication strategy to penetrate all of us. I think there's probably a somewhat higher recognition in Europe than there is in the US, that this is a global problem that is going to be critical for us in the States to help solve. Okay, with that as a preamble, I'm not an expert in the area for sure, but as you and I have talked in preparing for this, CCS, carbon capture and storage, would seem to be, and the more I've done to acquaint myself with it, the more I see of its potential. It's a technology, I think it's fair to say, Chris, and you could can and do talk for hours on this, but it's a technology in its infancy. It's not yet commercially viable, but it's proving to be technically viable, if you will, or scalable with more experience and with more investment. I would love, frankly, to cede a little time back to you to tell all of us how this CO2, how fracking relates to our ability to remove CO2 and re-inject it, if you will, in the reverse of fracking. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, look, it's not really fracking. So fracking is just in very tight formations being able to fracture the rock so that you can release gas. We would target for CCS, we would target a different kind of formation, more the conventional oil and gas formations, which are much more permeable and porous, and which have a seal, like a cap rock that will contain the CO2 after you've injected it. Look, it is really interesting, and you know, I think Tom mentioned in the intro, I ran a large CCS project. You know, what I convinced myself of was that this is a technology that's technically viable. I think that with the right level of characterization and robust regulation, you can inject cost effectively and safely, and that CO2 can be permanently stored in the right locations. So you know, for me, it comes down to when you see this large fleet of carbon intensive assets that is still being built, we're going to have to find a way to avoid stranding those. The economic loss in those countries probably won't be tolerated. And CCS is probably the right solution. And then there are some other technologies like, you know, CO2 capture from cement plants. There's no other solution that's scalable today to mitigate emissions from the cement industry, which is a very large industry around the world. And then ultimately, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, ultimately, if we don't make the progress we want, we're going to have to find a way to extract CO2 from the atmosphere. And so there is work being done, and the US is kind of leading the way now, of extracting CO2 from the atmosphere, purifying it and injecting it into the subsurface so that you're drawing down the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. So to me, CCS is one of these technologies that's kind of got a lot of option value for the future. And I think the US is ideally, is really the best equipped country in the world to kind of lead the charge on this.
Well, from the non-technical side of things, from the policy side, the discussion that you've so helpfully gotten me thinking about for the first time, frankly, is what's the economic model? What are the economics? How is this going to play out? Probably after my time on Earth, but how is this going to play out in a critical, let's say, 2030 to 2040 timeframe, when I think even the optimists would say we still have enormous work to be done, and we turn quite seriously to CCS and other technologies yet to be born. What's the economic model for that? And how should we begin to think in the United States? And the only thing that comes to my mind is an imperfect analogy, but it's an analogy that has resonated over the decades, and that's the Marshall Plan, which produced enormous amount of good, frankly, at a relatively small cost in the immediate post-World War II era. And I think it's going to be incumbent for policy makers, for thought leaders, for the discussion to begin to turn to how we can help, how we in the States can help fill the financing gaps, can help fill the economic gaps, can help make the transition in societies which have had to, for their own economic development, continue with coal plants. And if that's a principal challenge over the next 30 years, and it certainly is, then we are one of the precious few countries that can help the entire world in that effort. So it's I don't pretend to have answers about an economic model, but that's the kind of discussion perhaps that we need to focus on.
Yeah, look, I think that's really critical, and it creates a global imperative, and the US's role as a global leader in trying to help the poorer countries who really, quite frankly, won't be able to achieve this on their own. And I think CCS is a really interesting one. You know, you ask about economic models just for CCS alone. It really is starting to get some government support in the US now. And most of the other, like wind and solar, has enjoyed government support for some time. And I think this next 10 years is a time when the US can really make CCS a commercially viable proposition, a real option that we can deploy at scale, but also that we can then show the world, and I'm thinking particularly the developing countries, how they can deploy it at scale. And I think that's going to be really critical. And I think this approach of this coordinated kind of Marshall Plan in terms of the global side of the challenge is going to be really useful. And just turning again to the poorer countries we were talking about, we've still got quite a number of countries in the world where what I'd call energy impoverished. So 1 billion people in the world without light, for example. 2 billion people in the world, at least, who are still cooking with biomass in really crude, quite smoky stoves indoors. We've got to help those societies actually come out of poverty as well. What sort of initiatives do you see in that front?
Well, on one, essentially, we're a startup NGO called Little Sun, which was formed in Berlin by a renowned artist with personal solar devices. And we have now begun a series of initiatives, including solar-powered cold storage units that can be container-sized. So there's no question off-grid, as you alluded to, off-grid issues, they don't rise to the level of being major contributors. But I think the way we view them at Little Sun is the more innovative we can be on attacking any number of UN Sustainable Development Goals, the better off the climate will be, and the better off economic development will be. So when you combine a clean energy, when you combine a solar lamp, which permits light at night for childhood education, when you pay attention to gender equity with women small stakeholder farmers in Africa, which their productivity is far less for a lot of systemic reasons. So combining SDGs, looking at not only clean energy, but the multiplier effect, if you will, of having your clean energy initiatives perform multiple kinds of innovative solutions is a way, I think, to think about the developing world and how all of us can have an impact. So that's just one example on a very small scale, but a scale we hope will get much bigger.
That's terrific. And so speaking of scale, and this is probably going to be the last point I make before we have questions, but you're aware of the Princeton Net Zero America study that we recently completed and which Tom mentioned. What it highlighted was really the unprecedented pace of deployment of all sorts of things. For example, doubling annual energy efficiency improvement for the next 30 years. Putting more than 250 million electric vehicles on the road in the US, 3 terawatts of wind and solar, bioenergy expansion, 1 billion tons of CO2 being captured and stored, and all of this happening in parallel over the next 30 years. And if we scale this up to the global challenge, then we're talking about a requirement for 10 times this sort of activity level. So, all the things you've talked about, the innovation, the capital markets, it strikes me that the time is ripe to really mobilize all of this. And I just like that term you use, like a Marshall Plan. Is that something you could unpack a little more? Just what might that involve, and how the US might initiate that kind of opportunity?
Well, the initiation will be about at least 5 years worth of discussion and creating far more of a political will in a very divided country. And I think, Chris, the only answer I can give you is success builds on success, and taking electric vehicles as a good example for the states, solving the problems to widespread rapid adoption of electric vehicles, i.e. range being one of the principal among them, creates its own dynamic. And I think it's very useful to think about electric vehicle adoption creating the kind of change, if you will, from a 100-year-old transportation system. And I'm not directly answering your question, but I'm positing that if we all think more clearly and cogently and optimistically about solving EV problems, getting as many cars as we can out there, that helps to create a political climate, if you will, for generosity, for a recognition of what the problem is and what we have to do to solve it. So these are all complicated issues, and in electric vehicles alone, there's more goal setting, but it's goal setting in the 2030 to 2035 range. That you're alluding to the fact that might not be quick enough, and I'm acutely aware of that. So we simply need to push where we can, and I think electrics are a good place to make rapid progress if we can.
And just what about natural solutions? I'm thinking we often focus on technology, and that's the right thing for us to do, but we shouldn't forget about natural solutions, right?
We shouldn't, and we have the World Economic Forum in conjunction with our NGO that I'm involved with, American Forest, and any number of other NGOs are beginning what we call the 1 trillion tree initiative to plant 1 trillion trees over the next 10 years. And again, there's going to be less pushback about that. There's going to be maybe a greater societal consensus. There's going to be a lot of movement, corporate movement behind it. But to give you a sense of scope, we've had pledges to date to plant 1.1 billion trees. That, as you do the math, it's 1/10 of 1% of 1 trillion. So again, the scope is, I'm simply agreeing with you, the scope is daunting here. And the only way I know how to answer a scope and scale question is begin to make the most rapid progress you can and have that become the new reality that becomes important to more and more sectors in our society and in other societies. And we're not there yet as a popular cause. And with leaders, like you, we'll get there.
Great. So that's probably a good opportunity, Tom, to turn to some questions, if there are any coming through.
Yes, absolutely. Plenty of questions. So let me start with this first one. It's about other energy sources, green energy sources besides wind and solar. And let me just read the question to you. It makes sense to me to talk about solar and wind as the biggest pieces most widely deployed, but I thought there would be more significant region-specific energy options that might be preferable for those regions, like hydroelectric, tidal, geothermal. Are there places where wind and solar might not be the best answer? And as a follow-up to that, what is the role of nuclear power for the US's path to net zero?
Maybe I will start. Or do you want to start?
Yeah, can I take a crack at the nuclear from a non-scientist perspective or a non-nuke perspective? I've been a big believer in nuclear as an absolutely indispensable piece of this puzzle. And I think we all know why it has fallen short. Any number of reasons: complexity, cost, Fukushima, we're not in a good place. Here's another example, and you would know far more than I. We do have some small scale nuclear modular kind of nuclear solutions that are undergoing the regulatory approval process. So I would look to that. If we can do small scale, replicable, safe nuclear, that becomes a significant piece of the solution that I frankly think is not on most people's radar right now. But I'd love to hear your thoughts and also on the others.
Absolutely. So the way I describe, I think the focus for nuclear, firstly, should be on the small modular reactors. I think that we have so many challenges to build traditional large-scale reactors, in most OECD countries around the world. And the capital size of the investment you need to make just becomes more manageable, and there's more people in the private sector that can take the small modular investment. In our net zero studies, we have 5 scenarios that we didn't prefer one over the other. And certainly nuclear plays from zero in a scenario which disallowed it. In the others, it plays anything from a modest role, maybe building 50 gigawatts of new nuclear, so it's half the scale of the US today, to quite a substantial role in which we built 285 gigawatts of new nuclear, which would be 3 times the US fleet today. So to me, which one of those scenarios can play out in the field of public opposition and community support and all of those things, we don't know, but it seems to me that it's an option we should certainly have on the table, and it's too early to take it off. In terms of some of the other opportunities, the person asking the question raises a very important point, is that every location is unique. Every region of the world has its own unique resource endowment, its own characteristics which will make different energy sources more viable. So places like Norway has almost 100% hydro in its electricity system. Places like Vietnam have something like 40% hydro. But not everywhere is endowed with that capacity. And there are some environmental impacts of hydro. So yes, it plays a role, and it will play a role. Geothermal, places like Iceland get a lot of their electricity from geothermal energy. Tidal solutions to me seem a little more difficult to scale. They do exist. They do have a place in certain locations. They're probably not going to be a dominant solution, would be my assessment at this point. But good question. Back to you, Tom.
Great, terrific. So let me combine a couple of comments and questions here. So from your conversation, we should frame the problem and solution in terms of economic development as opposed to necessarily an energy problem or a climate problem. So how can we energize capital markets to rapidly advance our transition? And let me add a second question here. What about circular economy solutions? Can the US implement circular economy solutions to help us achieve these climate goals while creating green jobs and making supply chains more resilient?
Who'd like to open, Bill? Or?
Well, I can only answer meaningfully and saying that to me is a process over the next 1 to 3 years, helped, I hope, significantly by Glasgow at the end of the year. All of the discussion that is going to be had from Secretary Kerry to everyone else in the Biden administration, filtering out to the rest of us, is going to be related to how fast we can make progress and how fast we can change, frankly, we can change our thinking. At the hint of a market solution, yes. Do I think Wall Street will be there and the market will be there? Yes. We're a little ahead of the market frameworks for some of the solutions we're talking about, but we're not far ahead. So I would say we put a good 1 to 3 years into the economic case for much more robustness in circular economy and what kind of, and it is going to be federal government leadership, I think, which can encourage that, the right kinds of incentives. Where the market needs a little push, the Biden administration, I think, is creatively thinking about what it can do. With the market as it is now, EV is really a question of consumer acceptance. The financing will be there. And I think you'll find that in a number of other related areas. But I will defer to Chris for more specific answers.
Yeah, I like the comment about reframing the challenge away from an energy system challenge to an economic development mandate. And I would go one step further and say, you know, with any sustainability issue, and I put climate as one among many, so we could add water scarcity, we could add biodiversity loss, etc. I think it's really important that we think about transitions across multiple domains. So economic domain, the economic development imperative is really important, but there's a social imperative. So, you know, with climate change, with biodiversity loss, with water scarcity, with etc., there are, you know, social impacts. People are social justice impacts. People are impacted differently. And of course, then there is the environmental domain. So I think we should always have our framing around these multiple domains and not focus on just the technocratic, we're trying to change the energy system. So that's a really good point. And I think that plays to the same part of circular economy. I mean, this is about using less, doing more with what we have. And that has to be central to any strategy that's about a more sustainable future. We simply consume too much in the world today. And then on capital mobilisation, I think you're right. I think capital markets are there. They are capable of mobilising really. We just need some way for needs to be, I think, some balance of public-private partnership here, where the role of government is about de-risking and streamlining what needs to happen in order to mobilise that capital, because it's about risk profile for me, ultimately.
On social justice, just briefly, because again, these are initiatives really in formation, but thinking about underserved areas in major American cities and heat deserts in a way with a social justice component that we call it American Forest called tree equity. It's a good framing device for thinking about an environmental problem in a way that can contribute to social justice and economic development. And to me, the importance of that is simply articulating it, simply thinking about tree planting, not just as an arid or as a standalone exercise, but as part of a training and redress of past wrongs and economic development in inner city areas. Urban gardening on a much greater scale would be the same thing. So all those framing devices, if you will, can help us think about the climate challenge in a broader way.
Great response. Tom?
So you've both spoken about electric vehicles and CCS. And there's a convergence point. What technology do you think might win Elon Musk's $100 million X Prize for the best CCS technology?
That I don't know. And I think Elon Musk's prize was focusing on direct air capture from memory. So extracting out, I think it's a wonderful initiative, and I hope it really does bring forward some genuine breakthroughs. But I certainly am not in a position to judge, what innovations might win. I would just comment that they just need to be much more cost effective than that technology is today. And that's what he's trying to encourage. And so I wish everybody who has an application to make the best.
Chris, you can help me, and I'm sure the audience. We haven't spoken one word of hydrogen. Can you give us a 3-minute exposition on where green hydrogen stands in this whole mix?
Yeah, so hydrogen obviously has the potential to be a significant substitute for conventional fuels, and we can either use hydrogen directly for heat, for cooking potentially, or we can synthesize it with carbon to produce a fuel which essentially carries carbon neutrality. So it could be, we could actually synthesize replacements for natural gas or fuels, liquid fuels. So I think in our scenarios for Net Zero America, hydrogen was a key carrier, either as an intermediate or as a final use carrier in every scenario, absolutely every scenario. In terms of green hydrogen, I tend to think about clean hydrogen. So there are 3, at least, pathways to produce it. One is by reforming natural gas, so essentially taking the CH4 molecule and creating the H2 molecules, and then you have to capture the CO2 and sequester it. So that's kind of where hydrogen and CCS play together. The second option is doing a similar thing, gasifying biomass. You could do this with coal as well, but unlikely in the US. But gasifying biomass, separating the CO2 and again sequestering that. And that produces a hydrogen that not only is clean, but also attracts a negative emissions credit because the bioenergy that you grew had already extracted CO2 from the atmosphere. And then, of course, the third one is the use of, is basically splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. And so that's where, large-scale renewables like wind and solar and hydro and anything else, or nuclear, can actually produce the electricity which drives the electrolysis process to split the water and produce hydrogen. And I think that's the technology that a lot of innovators, a lot of policymakers are counting on as sort of driving the clean hydrogen revolution. Right now, it's a bit expensive, but obviously there's a lot of investment in R&D and in demonstration projects around the world. And one of the really interesting opportunities is that countries which are rich in resources, like, Australia, for example, where I'm from, has enormous potential for solar and wind and a relatively small domestic economy and large tracts of unpopulated areas which have very good solar resources, for example. And so there is the potential for a country like Australia and the US, to be honest, to produce kind of hydrogen in scales larger than they need, and then to export that as a fuel for more landlocked countries that perhaps will have trouble to provide their own energy in a low carbon future. So hydrogen is really important, and there's a lot of I think a lot of emphasis on that right now.
Let me combine a couple of comments that have been submitted here. So I'll start with this. I understand the idea that making the transition in the countries with the largest economies is mostly a matter of political will, but that's not an insubstantial obstacle. What do you make of the Texas power grid failure as a case study in energy infrastructure and politics? And do you think that when the dust settles on the talking points, that this example will help with arguing for greater investment in renewables or not?
Well, I sure hope so. I would be extremely dismayed if it didn't. Again, I'm hardly an expert on what went wrong in Texas, but I think it was a it was a wet, extreme weather-related phenomenon which sent a lot of different sources crashing at once. Not helped by the fact that the Texas grid is not interlocked with the rest of the country's grids. So all I can do is say yes. I would think that on transmission alone, this will be an impetus. This will be an impetus for investment. That's another subject we haven't really dealt with. But I think transmission upgrades are very much in play now post Texas.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I think what it pointed out to me was the term that comes to mind is resilience. I think, whether it's transmission, whether it's connecting to other states, whether it's having a substantial balance of different resources, where wind, solar, natural gas with CCS, nuclear, etc. Having diversity in your mix, having backup, having the ability to transmit to and from other states. I put all of this together as in the term resilience. And sort of one of the anecdotal things that I heard in Texas was that, the weather event was such that a number of components on instrumentation for both turbines and for gas pipelines failed because of the cold conditions. Now, these cold conditions are experienced, every winter in Minnesota, for example. And so, we need to be thinking about resilience, which would force us to think more broadly about the types of conditions that our energy system has to cope for. So I would think about it in terms of resilience, which would point to diversity and which would point to redundancy. Having backups and interconnectedness would be what I hope we take away from Texas, and will have a really key role in sort of framing policy.
I think we've got time for two more, so I'm going to pick these two. First is a comment on the Princeton campus energy system, and that on our campus we rely on a thermal storage system and time of day usage. Could such solutions be widely deployed and help with this cause?
Look, I think the Princeton campus offers a great laboratory, almost what I might call a microcosm of net zero America. And in fact, in the Princeton Daily, there's a magazine that gets, maybe it's a weekly, there's an interview with me that's coming out today, and we're talking exactly about the Princeton capital plan and the climate approach to it. And so it's a great example, and I think it can exemplify the technology solutions around thermal storage, time of use, but also uptake of renewables, uptake of electric buses. All of these are part of it, geothermal energy use. And the other part of it, I would say, is that it's an opportunity where we mobilise widespread behaviour change, right? So amongst the faculty, but also amongst the student body, where, you know, sustainability is really brought forward in our thinking, in our decision making, both in terms of day-to-day activities, but also in terms of investment decision making at the executive level in the university. And if we always have, you know, our sustainability at the forefront of our decision making, I think we can really show Princeton University as an exemplar. I think it's a great point that person's made. Bill?
Can't add to that. I agree.
Okay, well, this is very closely related, but it'll help us, I think, end on a high note. This might be the last question as we're approaching the 5:30 time here. And this is a question about whether you could cite a favorite success story of a relatively large scale renewables transition that you look to as a model.
I'm sure Chris can. I would point to solar, but you know what? I'd turn it around and ask Chris. One of the paths in the Princeton plan is a massive expansion in wind geographically, and I'm quite intrigued because I would think that would be extremely difficult to pursue from a land use and a political standpoint. How do you see expansion of wind? It can clearly be done technically. How can it be done politically?
So, I mean, on the political side, I think there's a number of things that play into it. One is the job creation. So when I look at the net zero scenarios, there's a lot of solar and a lot of wind and a lot of CCS and a lot of, you know, a reasonable amount of nuclear and other things. And what we saw in every scenario, especially the high renewables scenarios, was really a large increase in employment in the energy sector. And so if you think about wind in the Midwest, you should also think about this is an opportunity to renew the economies, the Midwest economies, right? It's a real renaissance opportunity. So I think, you know, if we think about costs and benefits, yes, there is visual amenity. The land use footprint of wind is actually relatively small. You know, an individual turbine occupies a relatively small part of the landscape, but it's really the visual impact that is the more concerning thing for many communities. And so I think, you know, making the communities partners in this transition is going to be really critical, because without their enduring, robust support, then Bill's right. This is not going to happen. So I think we need a new regime of stakeholder engagement and community partnerships and really involving the communities in siting decisions. It's going to take that kind of relationship, I think. But we've also got to articulate and sell and make sure we deliver on the jobs benefits, right? So that means making sure, as you said earlier, Bill, that we do nationalise our supply chain capacity, build our manufacturing bases. This energy transition can really be an economic boon and a real job creation opportunity for Americans that have seen jobs leaving the country over the past decades. So that's probably how I would answer that. And then just to the other, is there a place in the world where I think it's been, you know, there's been great stories of wind in Denmark, of wind and solar in Germany, not without their challenges. So I think, it's rare that we've seen a really successful transition But I think we've learned a lot from the lessons. And so things like how we deal with communities, being more sensitive in citing decisions, I think there's potential for us to get it right going forward. And I'd like to let Bill close because I think we're close to time. So Bill, do you have any last remarks?
Oh, it's been a privilege, Chris. I've learned an enormous amount. And in the policy sphere, there is significant work to be done, but the work is fairly begun. So it's going to be an exciting 10 years where we simply have to show the greatest possible degree of progress across all these fronts. And the more we can enlist in this effort, the better.
Yeah, and I want to say also it's been a great privilege for me. I really appreciate your perspective, you know, and there's a huge amount of wisdom that comes with the vast experience you have. And certainly what I just wish you well in your continuing efforts to advocate for legislative change in DC and elsewhere in the world through your various initiatives. And, you know, we need, as you say, all hands on deck. It's a big challenge, but I think we're up for it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, gentlemen, both of you, for a fantastic conversation. And thanks to all for tuning in. If you'd like to remain engaged with further conversations at Princeton on energy and environmental issues, I invite you to look at the High Meadows Environmental Institute, the Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment, and the School of Public and International Affairs websites. Their public events calendars are full of interesting opportunities to participate in continuing dialogue. And with that, final thanks to you both and to our viewers, and we'll say good night.
My name is Sabrina King, and I've been working at Princeton for 15 years. I am a 2001 graduate of Princeton. Every year that I spend at Princeton, you realize the depth of how much goes into running the university and making the student and the student athlete experience really great. I mean, on my day-to-day, really all I'm doing is trying to make the student